I want to thank you all for coming here today and joining us. We're joined here today with some advocates from around New York State and as well as others who have shown their support from around the country regarding some common sense changes to, and simple changes to our guardianship law. And you're going to hear from some of these individuals, particularly to my right, Christine Montanti, who lived a personal horror because we don't have very simple procedures to visit someone who is in the care of a guardian or who is otherwise under the control, for lack of a better word, of a guardian. And just to give you a little background, under Article 81 of the Mental Hygiene Law, you make an application to the court when you have an alleged incapacitated person. And that person may not be able to take care of their personal affairs. It's either their personal decisions, health and safety, so to speak, or their property. And in situations when there are personal differences possibly between the proposed guardian, you do not have access to the individual. So in many cases, as we've seen and was particularly highlighted during COVID, that we have individuals who cannot visit or even see a loved one because the guardian or the attorneys for the guardian or conservator, for example, will not allow you access for no reason whatsoever. So we're not suggesting that these are situations where there's an alleged abuse or someone is unduly influencing the AIP, as we refer to them. This is just simple common sense visits, just to see that person who are typically, when guardians are appointed, obviously they're not well, so we're dealing with situations where they're typically at the end of life. There are many famous cases that we all have heard. We've heard of Britney Spears when she was hospitalized and her father obtained a conservatorship, but this is more along the lines of guardianship. For example, Casey Kasem. Many of you may know he had several family members, I believe upwards of 20 members, were excluded by his second wife while he was on his deathbed simply because she didn't want them to see him. And ultimately that was not resolved and he passed. So in the later stages of life, they were unable to see this poor man simply because of personal differences. Wendy Williams, her son, apparently same situation, has sold her home out from under her. This is ongoing as we speak today. So this is not just a problem in New York, this is a problem nationwide. Very simple change to the mental hygiene law. What this bill will do is mandate a hearing within 10 days of the application to make a decision regarding visitation. That's all. We're not making an overall decision on the case. That will run its typical course as it would in the courthouse. Have hearings, doctors, and so forth to see if, in fact, a guardian does need to be appointed. But this would require a hearing, and it would be a rebuttable presumption of visitation. So unless you can prove by clear and convincing evidence that this person should not see their loved one, they get to see them, and the hearing would be immediate. Very simple, and these procedures don't really exist anywhere that we could find in the country. Quite frankly, as you'll hear from Ms. Montanti, the pain that she had to endure, it doesn't exist in Florida as well. So this is something that is very important, and it's just a simple common sense change. There is due process. You ultimately would go to court in a very short period of time to see your family member. And you would think it's almost counterintuitive to not allow this, because when you have someone who is not allowing access to someone who is struggling with their mental capacity, you would almost think that there's got to be a reason for that, that they're either unduly influencing them, looking to maybe preserve or conceal assets. It just doesn't make sense. So I think from every aspect, when you review this proposed legislation, it makes sense. So with that in mind, we are joined, and you're going to hear Christine's story about what she had to experience with her mother. So I invite you to the podium, Christine, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Senator Palumbo. Thank you all for coming here this morning. I'm incredibly grateful that Senator Palumbo is sponsoring this new bill called Karilyn's Law in the New York State Legislature to safeguard New York State's most vulnerable individuals and to prevent them from ever having to go through what my mother has experienced over the last 4 years. Sadly, guardianship abuse has existed in this country for half a century, and the cruelties that caregivers inflict on their wards is incomprehensible, and sadly, it's evolved into a real-life, modern-day tragedy. So what's heartbreaking about my mother's story is she was kept in a jail-like atmosphere by 3 individuals who were appointed by the very judge to protect her interests, but instead were engaging in abuse by keeping her locked up and isolated. This jail-like isolation occurred at 2 separate assisted living facilities where my mother was denied complete access to the outside world, no communication, no contact. She was not allowed to leave her assisted living facility while every other resident at that facility could leave. She was not allowed on her balcony. It was nailed down and shut. Virtually all of my mother's personal belongings and property were confiscated from her. Her telephone, her clothing, her jewelry, her photographs, her shoes, her dishes. She was not allowed to receive letters, packages, or food delivery. And she was blocked complete access for her entire family, friends, and only grandchild without ever having an evidentiary hearing, without due process, without being given notices of any hearings that were being held. And she spent all of her time in complete isolation, all of her holidays alone, her birthday alone. And so while under the care and supervision of 3 court-appointed individuals who were entrusted to oversee my mom's medical care, my mother suffered from 4 over-medication issues. Never before has my mother ever suffered from over-medication issues, not even when she was in charge of her own care. So what's completely outrageous is my mother was paying these individuals thousands of dollars every month for the sole purpose of overseeing her care, and she's suffering from disabling symptoms caused from over-medication issues. So this is what my mother looked like before she was isolated. Before she was isolated, and this is what my mother looked like in the blue after 4 months of isolation. She dropped 3 clothing sizes, and she looked like she had aged years. So after my attorney, Ronald Denman, filed numerous petitions citing violations to Florida statutes and my mother's due process rights, suddenly the court removed all restrictions and actually disposed of my mother's guardianship case. And she was reunited. It was a joyous moment. My mother was reunited with her entire family, friends, and only grandchild. She was embarking on her newfound freedom. She moved to a facility an hour away, and she was seen by a independent forensic psychiatrist and was given a capacity evaluation where she received full capacity. Not only was she given capacity by this individual, she was seen by doctors, nurses, law enforcement agents, and Adult Protective Services who also evaluated her and gave her capacity. The only one who's not giving her capacity is the court-appointed doctor. So at this new facility, she went out to lunch, she engaged in daily activities, she saw her family several times a week, and was really just enjoying her freedom like any elder should do in their golden years. When suddenly this process started all over again only a few months later, and the person overseeing her care once again attempted to block her and isolate her. Sadly, my mother sustained a fall and broke her hip and was hospitalized, and she was receiving intensive rehab 7 days a week, several times a day. When this person, once again in charge of her care, moved her to a facility that wasn't equipped to offer that kind of care for my mother in that condition, and once again, she deteriorated. And she's still attempting, the person in charge of my mother's care is still attempting to isolate and block her, moving her from one undisclosed location to a next, and giving directives to facilities and law enforcement not to tell family and friends where she is. So after my mother was, all the restrictions removed, this is what she looked like. And then this is what she looks like today after she's placed back in the same kind of environment. So clearly you can see the difference of what's happening to my mother. So after litigating for my mother in court, I was contacted with numerous others, some of whom are standing here today with me, who share strikingly similar horror stories across the nation. After doing substantial research and speaking to advocates, law enforcement, nurses, doctors in the elder care system, I realized that this conduct was common practice. And no one is immune from guardianship abuse, no matter how prominent or celebrated the individual. as we clearly see in the case of Britney Spears, Amanda Bynes, Casey Kasem, Nichelle Nichols, and most recently in the case of Wendy Williams, right here, right now in the state of New York. So today, I'm not only seeking to free my mother from this horrific abuse and injustices that she's enduring, but I'm seeking to help others in the state of New York with Senator Palumbo's help and Assembly Member Thiel to sponsor this new bill and act it into law to protect vulnerable individuals and prevent them from ever having to go through this horrific ordeal. And I'm hoping that if this law is enacted, it will free Wendy Williams from her horrific ordeal. So I'm incredibly grateful for Senator Palumbo and for Assemblymember Thiel for stepping up, taking the lead, setting the precedents to reform guardianship for the rest of the nation. So I thank you for coming here today. Thank you very much for hearing my mother's story. On behalf of my mother, Karilyn, my attorney, Ronald Denman, myself, my son, Joseph, all of my family members and friends who are fighting for years to free my mother, again, I can't thank these two, Senator Palumbo and Assemblymember Thiel, for really sponsoring this bill, setting a precedent. Let's get every state to adopt this bill that will be enacted into law to reform guardianship. Thank you.
Great. And thank you, Christine. And you know, as you've heard, this story is not unique. And this is really the reason for this in a nutshell. When you think about, ultimately, the court got to the point of a determination, got to the point of receiving evidence, and removed all the restrictions. It just took, what, a year or so to do that?
It took, yeah.
So that's really what the purpose of this is. As we've mentioned, I'm now going to introduce the Assembly sponsor, Assemblyman Fred Thiel, to say a few words.
Thank you, Senator. And first of all, thank you for your leadership on this issue and for putting this bill together and bringing this matter to our attention on the Assembly side of the chamber also. And Christine, thank you for sharing your story with everybody. Obviously a very painful and difficult story to share, and we appreciate you.
Thank you.
Because there's obviously, you're not alone. We have other advocates here. As Senator Palumbo mentioned, you know, when it involves a celebrity, it gets national attention. But how many times does this occur when, you know, somebody isn't nationally known or internationally known, but just happens in day-to-day life? And we appreciate all that you've done to bring this to us here in Albany. And as Senator Palumbo said, this is a very simple bill. It's common sense, and you know, there's a, you know, those both Senator Palumbo and I are attorneys, and one of the first things you'll remember in law school is that justice delayed is justice denied, and in these cases, more than a year, and now going through the same thing all over again. You know, the two words that are important here with regard to what we're trying to do with this bill is due process. And with regard to family visitation, you would be able to go to court and get a hearing within 10 days, not have to wait a year, not have to wait 6 months, not maybe have to wait years, but get the situation before a judge in 10 days. And that's all we're asking for here. I think all of the advocates here, they realize if they can get their case before a judge in a timely fashion, they can make their case and get the result, and justice can be done. But sometimes in our courts, especially in the wake of the pandemic and the backlog that are in courts right now, that it can be months and years. These cases should have a priority. We're talking about family relationships and the lack of access to family members. 10 days. That's what the bill would require, and it's a simple but very effective way of making sure that justice is done and justice is not delayed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Assemblyman. And it's a tight squeeze here on the steps, right? And you know, and I'm lucky. I'm very lucky to have Assemblyman Thiel in my district. When I was in the Assembly, we worked together. He's been a tremendous advocate on the mental health side. He and my predecessor ultimately created a behavioral health initiative. So he's a tremendous partner to have on this. And he's absolutely right that win or lose, it's just simply get in front of the judge. And that's what's important, is that we're not even necessarily, of course, we're advocating for a situation like Christine's and these other individuals here, but all it is a fair way to get to court. And even if there are issues, the judge can order supervised visits, just very similar to a custodial situation with adults and children. So I do thank you all for coming. I thank you, Christine and Fred, for carrying this in a bipartisan fashion. And we'll take any questions, but I appreciate everyone's advocacy, and I appreciate you all being here, and we're certainly ready to field any questions if there are any. See, that's good news. That means that we did such a good job here that clearly you understand. It's not a difficult bill, right? We get it. I mean, it's a very simple thing, and fortunately, we can hopefully push this as quickly as we can, possibly get it done before the end of session, which is really a tough sell, but the narrative has begun, and we can certainly fight for those individuals who need to be fought for, because that's what we're supposed to be doing in government. Great. I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Great.